Black people were greatly mistreated, massively robbed, and had our entire infrastructures removed, taken, and transferred to Europeans. This was one of the greatest thefts that has taken place, and this is real, it's traceable, it's tangible, and it's in the historical record. And these are the things that they're trying to, I guess, dissuade you from looking at when they place that slavery trope upon Africans. And this is why the addressing and the correcting of this narrative of slavery is so important. Slavery is not associated with the melanated or black race. It's actually associated with Caucasians. That's a fact. That's what it's named after. These are the people who historically this narrative was attached to.
Michael Ballard states, the growth of slavery that was stimulated by Italian and Catalan businessmen, but we must also take into account the impact of the local situation, wars, misery and piracy, which brought to the Pontic Caucasian markets young people and adults, enslaved and transferred to Egypt or to Western Mediterranean, i.e. the North African cities.
Now, does that leave us in a situation where black people don't have any rights to ask for reparations, to demand for better treatment? Am I suggesting that racism doesn't exist? None of the above. In fact, I would argue that the trope that has been attached to black people robs black people of the justice that they truly deserve. One of the things that you may notice is that when people associate you with slavery, it dehumanizes you to the point where it justifies their mistreatment. So to be clear, if people can look at you and assume and say, well, historically, you're a slave race of people, irrespective of you might, if you're really, really lucky, get a reparations payout, the fact of the matter is they're saying that your position in society has always been this. You have always been inferior.
Toledano expands on the psychological impact of slavery on a population. Yet, for the enslaver to be able to extract labor and services, the enslaved had to be kept alive and exploitable, physically and emotionally. Excerpt taken from Slavery in the Black Sea Region.
This is why they are very happy to shed their own slavery background, their own slave keeping and slave breeding background, their own history of millennia of slave acceptancy and incorporation into their culture. You saw the quote that I read from Dr. Nell Painter, how they would raise their young and sell their young to be slaves when no such practice has ever been seen on the African continent. And that's why they are willing to shed that history, that reputation, and they are willing to give that to black African people, even if it goes contrary to what the historical record and what anthropology tells us.
The sale of children by their parents seems to have been normal on the Caucasus shore, states Michael Ballard. Hannah Barker confirms. The history of the Black Sea as a source of Mediterranean slaves stretches from ancient Greek colonies to human trafficking networks in the present day.
Secondly, and more importantly, the slavery narrative focuses us on the abolition of slavery, which in the British case was 1833, and in the American case, I think it was around the 1860s, focuses us on those dates and tries to blind our eyes to the 1.5/2 centuries that succeeded that, in which black people were greatly mistreated, massively robbed, and had our entire infrastructures removed, taken, and transferred to Europeans. This was one of the greatest thefts that has taken place, and this is real, it's traceable, it's tangible, and it's in the historical record. And these are the things that they're trying to, I guess, dissuade you from looking at when they place that slavery trope upon Africans. We're all given this narrative that slavery was this 400-year oppression of exclusively black people where the whole world was basically taking black people and taking them to the Middle East, taking them across the Atlantic. And actually, it's not just 400 years, because historically, this is what's always happened to blacks. Let's look at the case of the Caribbeans, for instance. This is a place that really was settled by the Spanish in the mid-1500s. We know that they settled in the island of Hispaniola, which is modern-day Dominican Republic and Haiti. We'll come on to that shortly. And then the British themselves only really settled the Caribbean by the mid-1650s. So those are kind of like the dates at which these places were, I say settled, I mean invaded and colonized. Now we know by the late 1700s, early 1800s, that the island of Hispaniola had essentially been lost to slave rebellions. Or when I say slave rebellions, I mean the uprising of the people who were enslaved there, a mixture of indigenous and imports. And they had lost the war, or at least France had lost the war against an independent Haiti. So only the Dominican Republic side remained colonized. And in the case of England, they abolished the slave trade in 1807 and 1833 respectively. So this period of 400 years in the case of the Caribbean looks more like anything between 150 to 250 years. That's kind of like the period of which we're looking at enslavement of black people taking place. Let's also look at America. In terms of the American variant of slavery, we have the key date of 1676 being Bacon's Rebellion. And the reason that's the key date is because that's when Americans' version of slavery really became racially defined. Prior to this date, slavery was something that affected whites and blacks equally in America. I'm not going to go into full detail, but anyone who's well read on the subject knows that. But around 1676, after Bacon's Rebellion, that's when it became a racial thing, and the white race was created, and races became divided, and rights became divided on a racial basis. Whites were afforded rights over the black populations. Now we know slavery in America was abolished around the 1860s. So in the case of America, we're talking about really under 200 years of exclusive black slavery. Now, why am I saying all of this? I'm not saying this to suggest that the end of slavery was the end of black oppression. In fact, contrary to that, I'm saying the opposite. Let me give you another example actually. Let's look at the island of Diego Garcia. Now this island in the Indian Ocean was colonized by the British, and when the British arrived, there was a population there called the Caucasians. In fact, the native name is the Cagos Islands. And what the British did, and they've done to this day, in order to not afford the Cagos Islanders their rights, the Caucasians their rights, they've used the slave narrative. So once again, they're using this idea that, hey, when we arrived to the islands, there was no one here. It was empty. We brought you over as slaves to work the islands for us, but they were empty before we got here. Yet if you talk to the Cagos Islanders, and if you hear their side of the story, they say, no, we were indigenous to these islands. We were already here, and they wouldn't be the first black people present in the Indian Ocean or islands in the Indian Ocean. We know this from Andaman Islanders and Sentinel Islanders, that black people are indigenous to the islands in the Indian Ocean. These Cagos Islanders are native black population that have been there for God knows how many thousands of years, yet Britain know that there is value in the slave trope narrative, this idea that all black people in any location can be explained away via slavery. Now, why am I saying all this? I'm saying this to basically talk about the fact that since the abolition of slavery, and since Britain has given themselves that big pat on the back for abolishing slavery, but we all know that there were several benefits to ending slavery, and actually the ending of slavery was a massive financial benefit to most of the elite in the British population, who were paid out an exorbitant amount of money in compensation for ending the slave trade, even though, such as in the case of the Caribbean, they had no control over those islands. These quote unquote slave populations were militarily making it a completely unprofitable an unsustainable practice. So it was much more viable for them to close the slave trade altogether. If you want more detail on that, I've got videos on that subject, so don't worry about that too much at this stage. But the point being that since the abolition of slavery, the crimes that have been committed against black and melanated people have been very, very vast. Without going into too much detail, I want to read to you from a book called Sundown Towns by James Larvin, and I want to read to you from pages 92 and 93, so you get an idea of what they're trying to distract you from using this slave trope. Creating sundown towns by violence. Often white residents achieve their goal abruptly, even in the middle of the night. In town after town in the United States, especially between 1890 and the 1930s, whites forced out their African American neighbors violently as they had the Chinese in the West. Decatur in northeastern Indiana went sundown in 1902. As told in the excerpt from the New York Times, Adams County, of which Decatur is the eastern county seat, wound up without a single black household. A century later, it had only 5. Decatur exemplifies a widespread phenomena, little riots, most of which have never been written about even by local historians. There are cases of what Donald Horowitz calls the deadly ethnic riot, an intense, sudden, though not necessarily wholly unplanned, lethal attack by civilian members of one ethnic group on civilian members of another ethnic group. The victims chosen because of their group membership. Members of one ethnic group search out members of another. The search is conducted with considerable care, for this violence is directed against an identifiable target group. Towns with successful riots wound up all white, of course, or almost so, and therefore had an ideological interest in suppressing any memory of a black population in the first place, let alone of an unseemly riot that drove them out. Whites also tried to cleanse at least 15 larger cities of their more substantial non-white populations. Denver of Chinese in 1818, Seattle of Chinese in 1866, Akron in 1900, Evansville, Indiana, and Joplin, Missouri in 1903, Springfield, Ohio in 1904, 1906, and again in 1908, Springfield, Missouri in 1906, Springfield, Illinois in 1908, Youngstown, Ohio, and East St. Louis, Illinois in 1917, Omaha and Knoxville in 1919, Tulsa in 1921, Johnstown, Pennsylvania in 1923, Lincoln, Nebraska in 1929. Portfolio 10 shows an attempt in Tulsa. They failed mainly because the task would have taken 3 or 4 days given their governors time not only to call out their state national guard, but also to realize they would get considerable criticism and so with their state if they failed to act. Some of these larger riots received some attention, including books and historical markers, since they were unsuccessful, in that they failed to drive out all African Americans. They have left fuller records of the process, because interracial communities have no need to deny that they once had a black population. As well, they have black populations with their own collective memories. Indeed, in Tulsa, an ongoing controversy concerns reparations, but most of the little riots have gone entirely overlooked, and as a result, the pattern of widespread ethnic cleansings, of which these failed attempts represent the tip of the iceberg, is not generally understood. Moreover, even when the cleansings were incomplete, they made a profound impact upon surrounding towns, often inspiring satellite riots. Now I'm going to stop reading there because actually I could play you a couple of clips from James Larvin, which will probably explain the phenomena much better than I can.
Well, across the United States then between 1890 and 1940, as I discovered in doing the research for Sundown Towns, community after community drove out its black population. And I've uncovered scores of little race riots. We've always known of a few of the big ones, like I think it was 1917 East St. Louis, 1919 Chicago, 1919 Washington, D.C. Only recently has the memory of the one in Tulsa, Oklahoma, I think 1921, been recovered. We know of that one now. But I'm talking about scores more the race riot in Pinckneyville, Illinois, for instance, which I haven't even dated for sure, but I think was 1928, in which the black community was expelled, never to return. And it's an eerie sense that you have. I've been in the community in Pinckneyville called the Black Hills. Now, I got to tell you, it's not called the Black Hills because it looks like South Dakota. Okay, it is hilly, mildly hilly. I mean, we're talking Illinois after all. It's called the Black Hills because this was the black community. Since 1928, it has been all white, okay? And in Sundown Towns, there's a portfolio of pictures in here, which I recommend to you. There's a photo of the black school in Pinckneyville, which since 1928 has been a white house, okay? Now, I don't know if the black residents of Pinckneyville got paid for these houses. I do know they did not get paid market value because, of course, they fled in a night of terror, and it's real hard to negotiate a fair price under that condition, okay? And in many towns, for instance, Pierce City, Missouri, which had its riot a little earlier, 1901 or 1902, and there's a picture here of one of the houses in Pierce City had over 300 black folks, 10% of the population. Drove them out in a fiery night, burned some of the houses. The other houses just got taken and got lived in by white folks. Blacks didn't get a dime for this. This is just like what happened in Nazi Germany in 1937-38, okay? And this happened in town after town. Most recently, and I think this is just amazing, most recently in 1954 in Vienna, Illinois, when the black community was torched out, never to return, and nothing was done about it. Yeah, down in Mississippi, right? Alabama. No, the traditional South didn't do this. This is a phenomenon across the North, but generally not in the traditional South. Now it is in what we might call the non-traditional South, like the Ozarks, if you consider that South, or Appalachia, far western North Carolina, far east Tennessee, for instance, far west Maryland. But Mississippi, for instance, I lived in Mississippi for 7 or 8 years, so I did an exhaustive search of sundown towns in Mississippi. I believe I located 6, okay? How many have I found in the rest of the country? Well, I grew up in Illinois, so I decided I would do more research in Illinois than any other single place, single state, partly because if somebody said, well, I've heard that Kenilworth is Sundown Town, well, I knew that was a suburb of Chicago. Or if somebody says, I've heard that Villa Grove had a siren, which we'll get to Villa Grove's siren in a minute, I would know that that was kind of in eastern Illinois. I expected to find 10 sundown towns in Illinois and maybe 50 across the rest of the country. I found 472 sundown towns in Illinois alone, which translates to probably 10,000 across the United States, okay? This is a majority of all incorporated communities in Illinois, all right? Now this is astounding, and I wouldn't blame you if you don't believe me.
So why are these insights regarding the practices of segregation, theft, lynchings, colonialism, appropriation of land, wealth, economies globally against black people? Why is this an important thing that we need to highlight? Well, in my perspective, I believe the atrocities that have been committed against global black populations since the closing or the ending of slavery have been greater than that. Relatively, and I'm not saying not insignificant, but relatively small period of slavery itself. Consider what we just talked about in terms of what took place in the Americas. Town after town developed, built, created by skilled, freed black people, created their own towns, their own economies, their own industries, just to have them removed, stolen by state-backed violence, state-backed lynchings, and the most gross use of force against people who were essentially part of that nation. And it's a part of history that is just not spoken about. And yet we're so willing to talk about what happened during slavery. Or let's look directly at the African continent, which doesn't really have a history of slavery taking place on the landmass of Africa itself by Europeans. But what do we have since then? For instance, we could look at Belgium, where King Leopold II is responsible for upwards of 10 million deaths of native Congolese people. And the number of deaths that have been taken place as a result of genocide by imperialists and colonizers such as the British, who have committed atrocities that we can't even keep a trace of because of the subsequent acts of Operation Legacy and things like that they've done to erase their legacy and their history of abuse on the African continent. Probably tens of millions of people have been killed in Africa since slavery ended. The abuses of black people globally since the ending of slave trade, these abuses are traceable. They're financially measurable, they are recent, and they are substantial. And in my view, this false slavery trope, a trope that shouldn't even be attached to black people, but should probably be attached to other populations in the world, distracts people from this. The fact that people feel so bold to turn around to melanated and black people and go, oh, you're just a slave, you're the descendant of a slave, you don't have any rights to talk about X, Y, and Z, when the historical record says the exact opposite. It's most likely that black people in most continents on this earth have indigenous ancestry. There were native black people on every continent of this earth, and I believe that's being supported anthropologically in most recent studies. And for those of you who perhaps want to defend the slavery narrative and say we don't talk about slavery enough, the question I would ask you is, if we don't talk about slavery enough, then why don't we talk about white enslavement? Why do you think Europeans are so desperate to shed the idea that they were ever enslaved by Africans? Because I think they know that that narrative comes with the additional baggage of essentially not having things like indigenous status, not having anybody look upon you as being a people that perhaps were capable of even building a civilization. You know, people who perhaps participate in the selling of their people as their major industry are not going to be looked upon favorably, and therefore are going to be written out of history. And we've suffered immensely from that, and it's not even a narrative that matches our history. So these are just my views on slavery itself. It's incredibly complex, but also incredibly interesting to look back and see how much the narrative around the slave trade has shifted in the past 200 years. I hope that video has been informative to you. Please do make sure that you're subscribed. If you're on here and you enjoyed this discussion, make sure that you've hit that subscribe button, hit the like button. Also, I need to inform you that I am writing, or I'm in the process of completing a book called Reconstructing Egypt. The pre-sale is going to be open shortly, and if you're interested in that, please do make sure that you click on the provided link in the description, which will tell you how you can participate and get yourself an early copy. I've got lots of really cool perks available, and obviously I want everybody, or at least as many people as possible, to read this. So there's going to be very affordable digital versions of the book available for those of you who want to support. I also have a Patreon, and you could become a channel member if you wish to support the research that I'm doing. But I would just like to thank you for taking the time to watch this. I'm going to do a few more of these kind of sit and talk videos to try and get a bit more content out. Let me know if you enjoyed the format, and I think at that point we'll wrap it up. Peace.